Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, in places all over the world. We are very, very excited to invite you to the first webinar in a joint series that the CPC Learning Network and LINEA are organizing around social norms and violence reduction. My name is Mark Canavera. I am one of the directors of the Care and Protection of Children or CPC Learning Network. Our secretariat is housed at Columbia University. The CPC Learning Network was established in 2005, and we promote innovative research, we promote communities of learning, and are trying to support the building of the next generation of researchers and advocates for children and families all over the world. Joining me today are a number of esteemed colleagues and co-panelists. But before we get to them, I would like to introduce Marie-Céline Schulte from the LINEA initiative. Marie-Céline, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody. So just a little introduction to LINEA, the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation and Abuse at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It's an international and multi-pronged project exploring how social norm theory can be used to prevent the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and adolescents globally. Centering adolescent girls, LINEA aims to provide an alternative to research and programs which traditionally have focused on providing girls with skills and information. And instead, LINEA aims to better understand and address the interdependence of human behavior and the structural realities that shape the individual experience of adolescent girls. LINEA was established in 2014 and is a part of the Gender Violence and Health Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And the LINEA network today, in collaboration with CPC, but the LINEA network itself, it hosts a network of partners in research and programming, policy, advocacy, and funding who are also using social norms approaches to preventing sexual exploitation and abuse of young people. It's a very vibrant and open forum for groups and individuals engaging with and interested in learning about norms and structural factors that drive vulnerabilities to sexual exploitation. We are hosting webinars with CPC, providing a platform for cutting-edge research and initiatives. And we also organize biennial meetings of the LINEA network where selected participants can share insights and share them within a community of practice. And that community of practice is you. And thank you, everybody, for being with us here today.
Thank you, Marie-Céline. And just a quick note about this webinar format. First of all, this is going to be a webinar series, as Marie-Céline just mentioned. We will, at some point over the course of the webinar, put the link out in the chat box for all of you to see the webpage where we'll be updating this. We already have a date, but not yet a time for the next webinar in this series, but we're thinking these will pretty much happen monthly over the course of the next 6 to 7 months. So we're hoping this will be a really rich learning opportunity, bringing together the themes of LINEA and the CPC Learning Network. The themes of this series are going to be social norms as they relate to the fields of gender-based violence, violence against children, sexual exploitation, and the abuse of children and adolescents. And we will hear some of that today on our first webinar in the series. We are going to have robust time for questions and answers at the end after we have heard from our 3 presenters, who are Carolyn Enye, Claire Hughes, and Elaine Denny, and I'm going to introduce them in a bit more detail in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to point out that the questions box or the chat box, which you should see, is open at any moment. And so feel free to send through a question or a chat for us, and we will get that and bring that to the presenters. The order of events will be an initial presentation from Carolyn Enye about the project that she has been involved in Nigeria, followed by a quick set of just a quick moment for all of you to ask clarifying or quick questions about the nature of the program. Then we will have a second presentation from Claire Hughes and Elaine Denny about how they measured and monitored and tracked this initiative. Again, a very brief period for clarifying questions, and then what we hope will be a very open and robust Q&A period. Given the number of attendees, we have 110 people registered for this webinar. We don't think we'll be able to open the microphones, but we do hope that through the questions, we will be able to collate these and bring these back and get some rich back and forth that way. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce the project that we're going to hear about and our first speaker, Carolyn Enye. Voices for Change is the project that we're hearing about today, and it sought to strengthen the enabling environment for young women's empowerment in Nigeria. The program did this by taking a norms marketing approach to inspire young people's attitudinal and behavioral change towards women's role in household decision-making, women's leadership, and violence against women and girls. Carolyn will be joined by colleagues from Itad, Claire Hughes, and Elaine Denny. Let me introduce Carolyn first. Carolyn was leading the development of Voices for Change, which is a highly innovative social norms marketing approach to change attitudes and behaviors towards young women in Nigeria. As the team leader, Carolyn had overall responsibility for the program's strategic direction and operations. She oversaw the development of a lifestyle brand, Purple, hence the title of our webinar, Nigeria Turns Purple, that brings together young women and men in Nigeria, unpacking gender stereotypes and social norms that challenge discrimination at scale. The program had a strong focus on working with men on masculinity, including with religious and traditional leaders. Purple provides a free online learning space to reflect on issues of gender, relationships, violence against women, leadership, and financial management. Carolyn has worked for over 18 years on gender and behavior change, with over 6 years of working on child protection with Save the Children in Nigeria and across East and West Africa. This work included in conflict context centered on violence against women and girls. That being said, I will now pass the microphone and the screen to Carolyn Enye, who will give you a much more detailed and fascinating description of the program.
Thanks, Mark. Great to meet you all virtually. Good. So Voices for Change was a £29 million funded programme by Diffusion, which actually came to an end in November last year after 5 years. And although it was a 5-year programme, it was really conceived as a pilot of a 20-year vision for change, recognizing that normative change at scale is not a short-term input. So the first, I say 4 years of the program, because that really the first year was design, were to test and learn and work out what could work or couldn't work at scale. The program was very ambitious. It was experimental. So the presentation may appear very neat and linear, but it was definitely one of trial, error, innovation, and risk-taking. And I think what was really positive about, I would say, for the donor was that we did have the space to be flexible and adaptive in the design. I realize we have a range of experts listening in, people with those of you with expertise in violence against women and children and child protection, and those of you who are more interested maybe in the norms or the measurement. And I hope that each of you will be able to identify elements within the program that you find applicable to your field. So whilst we may be talking about marketing gender equality, there are clear parallels and learning that can be applied, say, for example, to shifting attitudes towards violence in children in a country like Nigeria. Another point I'd like to flag at the onset is don't be put off by the sparkly imagery and possibly frivolous look of the marketing techniques. The program was designed by gender, social norms, measurement, experts with years and years of experience, and a huge investment went in to making purple attractive, accessible, but as simple as actually looks on the screen. So the theory of change, I won't talk around the theory of change, but just to say that it evolved over the years. We did begin with having girls at the centre in a self domain, but realized after a year or two that actually that didn't depict the reality of what we were doing, which was working with all levels of society on self and on personal transformation. And I think most critically to point out, we realize that personal transformation creates agents of change who diffuse their evolving attitudes and behaviors and role model, and that leads to promoting wider change. So other people see those people acting differently, and through the use of mass media, others hear debate at scale. So this creates a synergy that catalyzes further change. I think it's important for us to stress at this point that this wasn't a violence against women and girls program exclusively. It was, as Mark said, a program to create an enabling environment for women and girls. But as we unpack the root causes of discriminatory environment in Nigeria, we realized that the fundamental norm at play was that men are more powerful than women. And so this, in essence, was the norm we wanted to change. However, we recognized that we needed hooks in which we could program and message, and identified norms around the three areas you see on the screen: violence against women and girls, decision making, and women in leadership. We now realize, years on, that there are numerous norms embedded within each of these areas, and if we were to do this again, we would probably unpack these further, and that would have influenced the look and approaches of the program. So in short, this is our very simple sort of idiot's guide to social norm programming. If there's sort of three clear areas, the first 2 points talk to starting with the self. This recognizes the need for personal transformation in a normative approach. And the points in yellow are around communicating the need to change, so publicizing debate. And finally, the last 2 look at showing the benefits of new behavior and social sanctions, and that relates to our work on legal frameworks. So how did we sell gender equality? In Nigeria, the words gender equality or women's empowerment are not that socially acceptable to anybody other than feminists or people like us in development agencies. So our first challenge was how to sell it in a way that really inspired young men and women to lead the change, not through isolated pockets of communities, but with a sense of scale. We were really going for a movement for change, and we needed both young men and women to drive that movement. So we employed a Nigerian marketing agency whose first words to us were, ditch, if you want to inspire 16 to 25-year-olds, you've got to ditch your earnest development do-good approach, which wasn't easy for us to hear, as everybody in the room were development earnest do-gooders, I suppose you could say. So it was a fundamental shift for almost all of us in the way we had to think. So the marketing agency really, they told us that we had to think much more about how to sell the idea of gender equality. Use the language and the style that resonates with your target audience, and that could be different from Lagos to Kano, Enugu, or Kaduna. And the agency really challenged us to create a movement as a new cool. So we shifted from talking about target beneficiaries to talking about our audience. And as a team, we really began to think like marketing experts. We focused on understanding men and women's likes, their dislikes, where they hang out, what do they talk about, how do they talk about it. So instead of trying to draw them to us, we aim to go to their spaces and infuse the debates and the discussions around gender equality into their space. So we created the lifestyle brand called Purple. Purple people sparkle, they shine. Purple people are the best they can be, and they help others be the best they can be. So the brand Purple really was developed to galvanize and inspire. It was very much a positive approach to promoting gender equality. And I think the critical role that the brand played was to make young people feel part of a group that believes similarly to them, which may be different from their reality or their norm. So it's creating a sense of belonging. And I mean, just to give an example, there was one young man who posted on our site. He said, if you slit my skin open, you'll see my blood runs purple. And it was that kind of in-depth belief that we were aiming to achieve, and belonging. And I think the other value of the brand was for young people to see a unifying message. So give a sense of normality to the messaging, make it popular, make it trend, and a sense of scale, rather than, say, a disparate set of activities. So in a lot of our programs, we would work with traditionally religious leaders, plus young people, plus communities, plus teachers, and media professionals. But what Purple was able to do was everybody to speak with recognizing that actually all of these people are talking about the same thing, and they're all supporting gender equality. So the aim was for young people to wake up in the morning, check Facebook, see Purple, listen to the radio on the way to school, hear talking about Purple, pass by billboards on Friday, listen to the Imam talking about Purple 50-50. Again, just creating a sense of scale and normality. So the first vehicle was a radio show. Radio is very popular in Nigeria, and particularly northern Nigeria, where young and old, rich and poor, male and female, all have good access. So radio was the media vehicle that had the most reach into the population. So it was a show with bags of humor, lots of twists and turns and lovable characters. Whilst the radio show and the brand overall was popular, we had a review after a year, well, 6 months to a year. We realized that the popularity was high, but actually nobody had any idea that this was about gender equality. So in an attempt for us to avoid going too heavy on the gender equality messaging, we had actually become almost gender neutral. So that's when we came up with the idea of the 50-50 campaign idea. It was a tussle though, because 50% of us in the office were nervous that if we were this explicit about gender equality, we would put off young and older men especially. And we were worried about religious leaders and traditional leaders who had already been explicit to us that they didn't believe, many of them didn't believe in gender equality, but they were okay about gender justice. And we were okay with using that different language because we believe people are on a journey, and we saw people on that journey. But we took the risk. And interestingly, it was an incredibly positive move, and we didn't see any fallout from being more explicit. We can't say for sure, but we wonder if that was because we'd already built up a following in the young people, that they enjoyed the space, they found it a very empowering space. So well, we don't know for sure, but it was an interesting lesson for us. So we worked on social media. We worked with influencers. The aim of working with the influencers was to get the debate out on the web, promoting these new norms and new ways of behaving. And it's important to understand for us that the aim of the social media presence was to support the spread of the brand and the messaging and generate discussion at scale. It wasn't necessarily, and we learned this latterly really, it wasn't necessarily to change behaviours or attitudes. We don't, our sense is that the media, there's so much negative noise out there that you would be competing with, that you're not likely to get in-depth change with an individual unless it is an in-depth online program, which I'll talk about later. But the value is in the visibility and the promoting the debate. So social media, whilst we worked on it, wasn't our core medium for behaviour change amongst young people. The more transformative work we did with young people was channeled through physical and virtual online spaces, promoting self-reflection and change. But the numbers, as I mentioned before, the numbers of young people reached through here are minimal really compared to the radio. So we reached hundreds, maybe over to like 100,000 through this media, but whilst the radio reached millions. The next slide shows a map. This is just to give you a sense of the scale. The scale is achieved through having an online presence. So although we were working in 4 areas, 4 states, there was visibility and a presence in almost in fact, every state within Nigeria. So interesting for us to think about how you would maximize that in future programming. So I think I was just sharing there that we undertook research on being a man in Nigeria, and we really used those facts a lot in promoting debate around masculinity. Central to the approach of V4C and Purple was to work with men to promote gender equality and gender justice. Religion and tradition, culture play a powerful role in shaping societal norms in Nigeria, and we wanted to work with those powerful forces to bring about change. So both as agents of change, but also as a risk mitigation strategy to manage the potential backlash, which was a very real threat. For us, moving into particularly northern Nigeria, promoting gender equality was a huge risk, and particularly in such a visible way. So we worked with these individuals and taking them through personal transformation approaches. But I think what's important to flag here from a normative perspective is that we worked with them through these very small scale approaches, but that we were able to amplify their voices by taking their voices onto radio and onto television. We developed TV adverts, and this was a key learning for us towards the end of the program, is always trying to find, if there is small scale initiatives, how to amplify the impact of those. Finally, looking at the last points on our normative approach, we believe that the existence and implementation of laws contributes significantly to providing an enabling environment. So the program contributed to the passage of the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, which really was a significant milestone for Nigeria. But we realized that 4 years is too short a time. Changing laws takes time, and for laws to impact on norms, they need to be implemented, not just passed. So if we were to do it again, we would probably revisit the notion of sanctions and look more at localized sanctions in addition to the longer term goals of passage of legal frameworks. So, as I shared with you, this was a journey. We learned a lot. We learned what worked. We learned what doesn't work. and what we could do differently. So I've just put the site up there. There's a whole host of learning papers, a series of papers called legacy papers. And there we have papers issues ranging from working in the digital sphere, marketing norms, working with religious leaders, and around thinking and working politically for legal reform. So let me hand it back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you so much. So we have the clarifying question about the states in which this is happening. The two other questions that we received while you were talking, I think relate to the second part of the, well, all three actually, the second part of the presentation. The first is from Christina D'Alessandro, who asks, will you be talking more about what techniques you use to evaluate the program's success? And Christina, that is exactly what the second part of the presentation is about. And then Mathilde Gunzberger has asked a few questions. What learning from images and other research that you carried out did you take on board? Were there any lessons that you learned from these surveys? And also, can you tell us about the measurement framework and especially which indicators were most useful? So I think, if I've understood our webinar today, that is what's coming next. And so these are great questions that will lead us right into that. And then finally, one more that it may be helpful to clarify right now, Carolyn, is could you say more about the environment of these states where you're operating and what the gender norms were that you were trying to undo? Not undo, but to transform.
Yeah, so the four states do represent quite different, they are different in nature. So Lagos, I think everybody's aware, Lagos is an urban capital, highly populated, but the common strands ran through, which were the fact that violence against women and girls it's not a norm, and Elaine will talk about that, but it is an acceptable behavior. Very, masculinity, men are very much in control and are the decision makers, but this plays out slightly differently in each of the states. So we did have to message slightly differently, and some of the research that we did, we undertook a values research. So in each of the states, we looked at what were the core values of young people, but also the key influencers. So for example, in Lagos, the core values are to be successful, entrepreneur, whereas in Kano, one of the core values was to be a great family and community individual. So our messaging around violence and around women in decision making, women in leadership, were carved to inspire young men and women that in a way that it fits in with their values. So that whilst there were differences around the slight differences within the states, really the core norms around the decision making, women do not make good leaders, women are emotional, we saw that across all the states. The fact that men are the head of the household and should be in control of that household, that was across all of the states. So I hope that helped answer a little bit.
For sure. And another two questions have come in. One is relatively straightforward, another's quite deep. Alice Van has asked, how did you support referrals, such as for do no harm considerations? The other one I'm going to bring to our plenary at the end after we've heard about the measurement.
Okay, great. So referrals, so we did work with local partners in each of the states, and so we had names, addresses of groups where young women or young men could get support, and those were online. And those, when we worked with young people in institutions, we gave them to them. So those are in our resource materials as well. You know, again, this wasn't a violence against women and girls program, and an ideal scenario would be to have an element of behaviour attitudinal change plus the service delivery, but that just it wasn't the model. We weren't able to support that, so I think referral was our best option in that case.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the second part of the webinar, and Roberta, we will bring your question into the plenary discussion at the end, and a new question that's just come in from Abi Khalil. These are kind of deep and interesting questions that we'll get at. But for the second half of the webinar and the second presentation, we are going to be hearing from two very distinguished presenters. Claire Hughes works at Itad, a UK-based consultancy company specializing in the provision of monitoring, evaluation, and learning services to inform international development policy and practice. And I think what we've just heard from Carolyn, this was not just development as we've done it, we as the international development community for decades now, and this is some new thinking, and I think Claire has been at the forefront of efforts to measure that. Claire leads ITAD's gender theme, which has a particular focus on measuring social norms change, evaluating efforts to empower women and girls, and quantifying the value for money of women and girls empowerment. Even just saying that sentence out loud makes me think we're in a new world where we're talking about the value of money for women and girls empowerment. So very fascinating. For the past 2 years, Claire has acted as the results director for DFID Nigeria's flagship gender program, Voices for Change, which we just heard introduced. It has taken a social norms approach to strengthening the enabling environment for young women's empowerment. Claire has also advised DFID and UN agencies on approaches to results measurement for norms programs targeting the elimination of female genital mutilation or cutting. Prior to joining ITAD, Claire worked for over 15 years as a social development consultant for a number of organizations, advising on policies, programs, and projects intended to empower women and men, to increase their access to basic services, and to address marginalization. We'll also hear from Elaine Denny, who investigates income and gender disparities in political participation, as well as programs that close participation and representation gaps. Elaine specializes in measuring social norms and norm change in response to development initiatives. Elaine has consulted with DFID and UNICEF, with experience conducting surveys and evaluations in Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, Senegal, and the Americas. With no further ado, over to Claire and Elaine.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to start taking you through our approach to results measurement on the programme and introduce you to some of our headline findings. And then Elaine will go into a bit more detail, drawing on findings from our attitudes, practices and social norms survey, which is one of the key instruments that we use to measure change in young people's attitudes and practices. So as Caroline has said, Voices for Change was very much intended to be a learning program, a program that was to contribute to building the evidence base around what works for social norm change and support of gender equality. And that really meant that we needed to invest in a very robust monitoring and evaluation system to help understand what exactly is driving change. So we had quite a comprehensive M&E system which looked across, measured different dimensions across the results chain. But especially we were interested in measuring the outcomes. What overall change did we manage to achieve, and to what extent did the program contribute to that? So these 5 tools that you see on the slide, they were the main tools that we used to measure Voices for Change's outcome level results. And the results that we're going to present to you later on are drawn primarily from the Attitudes, Practices and Social Norms survey and from the How Change Happens survey. So just to go into those 2 in a little bit of detail to give you a flavour for what they were. The APSN was a panel survey of young people aged between 16 and 25 years, so the V4C's target audience, and it sought to assess their attitudes and practices of people in their reference groups, their peer groups, towards the 3 behaviours that we were particularly focused on: the women's leadership, women's decision-making, and violence against women and girls. We drew a representative sample of 4,798 young people in the 4 states where we were working. And we use a mixed methods approach, so primarily quantitative survey, but then we also use focus group discussions with key informants to help unpack the findings that we were seeing in the quantitative data. And now, given the program design, we weren't able to have a control group. The media was obviously going statewide. That was our expectation, that it would be statewide. So we didn't have a pure control group. So instead, we used a difference in difference design to compare results amongst those people who were exposed to purple and those people who weren't exposed to purple, and could see if there were differences in the level of changes in attitudes and practices. So that's how we really started to understand the contribution that the program was making to any recorded changes. And with this being a panel surveys, we had 4 rounds of data collection over the 4-year implementation period. And the data that we'll present is comparing the change between baseline and end line. The second approach, the How Change Happens survey, very different, a qualitative study done very rapidly towards the end of the program in 2 of our states. And that was really to explore V4C's theory of change and how change happened in practice. And it did that by through semi-structured interviews with 3 actor types. So firstly, individuals who'd been targeted by the program and who were active in very nascent social movements in the 2 states. Then individuals who'd been similarly targeted by the program but weren't active in those social movements. And finally, the third group was the reference groups of those individuals, both those who were active and those who weren't active, to try to understand the extent to which there was diffusion, there was a ripple effect from our direct work and a rising tide of support for gender equality. Okay, next slide. So what did we achieve? Here are some of our headline results. Between 2014, 2017, Caroline, have we got, can we go back to the slides?
Sorry, I don't know what's happened there. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. So between that 4-year period, 89% of young people in the 4 target states improved their attitudes or behaviours in at least one of the 3 behavioural areas that we were tracking. And that equates to 2.4 million young people. Of those who recorded a change, 1.46 million of them recognised purple. And that included over 600,000 people who were in the poorer sections of the population, showing that although purple targeted more literate sections of society, it was also benefiting poorer groups and it was accessible to poorer groups. the purple logo, what our media tracking found was that the purple logo and the purple brand really resonated with young people, and 72% of young people understood without any prompting that the purple logo represents support for gender equality, and men particularly seem to have responded well to the 50-50 messaging. And if we think about, well, what kinds of changes were happening, it very varied. So it could be from just improved self-confidence, it could be an enhanced ability to speak out, whether to intervene in an abusive relationship, to stop an abusive relationship, or to stand for election in student elections, for example. Better skills and knowledge about gender equality and how that manifests itself in everyday life, and quite significantly changes in attitudes and changes in behaviours and what people do. Next slide. So that gives you a flavour of the breadth of results that we achieved, giving you a bit more depth about the insight into the depth of change that people reported, and how this change relates to the programme. What we found was that in our states, the majority of young people were improving their attitudes and behaviours, but those exposed to purple made larger improvements, and those with more intensive purple exposure recorded a greater level of change. So, for example, purple young people were much more likely to be thinking about gender issues than other young people who didn't recognize purple. And that thinking about gender issues, that contemplation is really important, because it gives us an indication of change in the future, the potential for change. If people are thinking about it, then it's already part of that change process, readiness for changing in attitudes and practices. As Caroline mentioned, some of our programming was much more intensive. So like we did physical safe spaces and online safe spaces, and that gave people more intensive exposure to the gender equality messaging. And as you'd probably expect, we found that exposure to that type of programming resulted in greater levels of change. But what we also saw was that if people had been exposed to multiple sources of messaging, that layering effect of different exposure, that also enhanced levels of change. Next slide. And here you can read for yourself. These are just some examples of the young people who were involved in purple, describing changes in their lives. And they talk about speaking out more, having more confidence to participate, enhanced personal aspirations, and being able to take action to address violence against women and girls. Okay, next slide. So moving on to broader society change, our evidence shows that V4C's personal transformation interventions mobilized agents of change in support of gender equality, and that they went out and they were diffusing their new attitudes and behaviors to others who weren't directly reached by the program. And so this was creating a ripple effect, and it was creating a rising tide of supporters for gender equality. And that process was very much in line with our theory of change. So what we saw was that our theory of change was our theory of action as well. So as a result of this diffusion, what we saw was that friends of people who were participating in our Safe Space program, they thought about gender issues more than young people in the general population who weren't exposed to purple. That not only were they thinking more about gender issues, they were more supportive of women being actively involved in household decision making and in leadership roles, and they were more disapproving of violence against women and girls. So there was a very strong ripple effect, and actually what we can conclude from that, because of that, there are people who've been influenced by the program without being directly reached by the program. And so when we relate that back to those headline results that I presented a few slides ago, we can conclude that those results are probably an underestimation of our actual results, because they're not presenting those people who don't recognize the connection with purple. They've been influenced by others. So those figures are probably an underestimation of the contribution that the program has made to the change that's been recorded. Next slide. And again, here are some of the reference groups of purple young people describing how their purple friends have influenced them. And they too are changing their own attitudes towards gender equality. So the first one, she says, before I met her, I was not supportive of gender equality, but after that, my perception changed completely. Next slide. I'm going to now hand over to Elaine, and she's going to take us through some of the findings from the Attitudes, Practices and Social Norms survey.
Great, thanks, Claire. Before I present any of the results, I just want to say that in recognition of some of the listeners' questions, talking about what the structure of the questions were, what our survey methodology was, and what our lessons learned from a large-scale quantitative survey on social norms is something that we could spend an entire hour talking about. And if you have additional questions, you can feel free to contact us, or keep an eye out. We have the Endline report coming out in the next couple of weeks, which will go into depth on our methods, the survey design, and we wrote that with an eye towards sharing lessons learned so that other people such as yourselves could adapt our techniques and build on our discoveries and lessons so that you can improve your programs as well. So please keep an eye out for that study. In the meantime, just want to highlight that we put together questions in 3 key behavior areas in line with the focus of the Purple campaign. So thinking about decision making, women in leadership, and violence against women and girls. And when we designed our questions, we focused on those 3 areas for attitude and behavior change. And answering one of the listener questions, I think we realized partway through programming that it would be good to measure higher level norms as well. So questions about power, perceptions of masculinity, what it means to be a man, and more questions that measure contemplation rather than just attitude and behavior. And so we added those into the latter waves of the survey. But were we to do it again, I think we would want to include questions not just on the key target behavior areas, but then also questions that show, that pick up change in contemplation over time and that get at perhaps higher level norms around perceptions of masculinity and power. I'm just making sure that we respond to all of the questions here. Yeah, and so talking through some of these key areas, we have evidence that shows that there's positive attitude and behavior change for both men and women who are exposed to the Purple campaign, and that change is larger than the positive change that we're seeing in the population as a whole, or especially among young people who didn't have exposure to the Purple brand. One thing that was a bit different and unique about our work was that we didn't just measure personal attitude and behavior change, but consistent with social norms theory, we also measured whether people's approval of others engaging in these positive behaviors had increased over time. and whether their perception that others were engaging in these positive behaviors had changed over time. Because, according to social norms theory, it's not just about what I believe and what I do, but whether I think others are engaging in this behavior and whether they will approve of me, whether I approve of them. And so we were able to show that not just personal attitude and behavior improved in the areas of decision making and leadership, but that we saw greater support for others engaging in these behaviors as well, and also greater visibility of positive behaviors in these areas. One other thing I want to just highlight in this decision-making area before we move on to the other target behaviors is that we see larger positive change among young people in the southern target states. And then in Kano, which is more conservative, we see less actual behavior change, so less positive change in how much women are making decisions, but increased attitude change, especially among women, and increased contemplation. So I think this is consistent with our assessment that Kano may have been at the beginning of our programming at an earlier stage in the continuum of change. And so we would expect to see contemplation and attitude change first, with then later behavior change. So I think this is also an indication of the importance of long-term continued programming, because sometimes you're not going to see behavior change right away. It's going to be attitudes or contemplation of gender that comes first with behavior change down the line. Okay, next slide, please. So we see positive change in the area of decision making. Similarly, there is larger positive change in young people's support of women in leadership positions. There's also increased visibility of women in leadership positions, and these results are especially strong in the South, and I think give us a lot of confidence and excitement about seeing the positive effects that the Purple programming has had. Again, we especially see strong results correlated with exposure to radio, exposure to the in-depth workshops that we ran at key educational institutions. And in our report, we break down these findings by exposure to different types of Purple programming. So you can learn what seems to have worked better or best. So again, you'd find that in our endline report. Okay, next slide, please. And so the third behavior area is violence against women and girls. And in this area, we see that there is general improvement in attitudes and behaviors with regards to violence in the general population. And we don't see a significantly larger positive change for people who are exposed to Purple. And we did a lot of thinking, a lot of additional research as to why we didn't see this extra effect in the area of violence against women and girls. And there could be a number of things going on, and we'd be happy to talk about this more. Measurement, as I'm sure many of you know, measurement of violence against women and girls is especially tricky because as it becomes more, as a discussion of certain behaviors becomes more widespread, people may actually feel more confident speaking up and sharing their own stories. So it may appear that prevalence is going up when it is actually, you have undercurrents of positive change. I should note that many of the questions that we used in our survey were adapted from survey language in the DHS, and then with additional layers of questions to get at those first and second order norms. The other thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that from the beginning, from the results of our baseline study, we were pretty sure that violence against women and girls didn't have the same social norms characteristics that we were seeing in other behavior areas. Namely, there was widespread disapproval of violence against women and girls already among our target population. So people knew that this was something that wasn't acceptable. And if it were a true social norm, you would expect to see behavior changing in response to that, because people are responsive to the approval or disapproval of others. And so it appeared to be more of a private behavior that's happening behind closed doors, even though there's widespread disapproval. And so it may be that a social norms approach to violence against women specifically wasn't quite the right fit. And so it'd be important to think about other practical factors or information skills that might be related to persistence of violence in private, even as disapproval of it was widespread in public. We also wondered if it might, in the future, a mass marketing campaign would be more effective in shifting this area if it were specifically targeted towards violence against, changing behavior with violence against women, because a 50-50 message is effective in changing how people think about a lot of different power dynamics. But in a violence against women and girls context, that may be perceived more as a concession of power rather than sharing of power or celebration of gender equality. So in the future, I think one of our lessons learned would be to have messaging and measurement that looks at maybe these meta norms, you could almost call them, of positive masculinity, of power and positive communication that we would expect to have downstream effects in the area of violence against women and girls, without thinking of violence against women as a norm per se. Okay, next slide, please. I know that we're almost out of time, so we just have one more point before we go to questions. Claire touched on this briefly, but I just want to emphasize it again because I think it's so exciting and so important for our field as a whole. And that is that from our population representative survey, we have evidence of a significant amount of diffusion of these positive attitudes and behaviors. So we know that for every person who participated in our intensive safe spaces workshops, for example, another 4 people had heard about Purple and had heard about the safe spaces programming through their friends. And when you look at that secondary tier of young people who had indirect exposure to our in-depth programming, there is a significantly larger positive change across the time period of our programming compared to either people who had more low-level Purple exposure or young people who didn't have any Purple exposure at all. So those effects are 1 to 3 times stronger among friends of in-depth participants compared to other young people in the population. And I think that this is something that hasn't really been measured before at scale. And it's really important for us to think about as practitioners because it shows the additional value for money of in-depth programming, because there is a second level of diffusion that could happen with measurable positive change. And this is in a number of different indicator areas, including willingness to speak up against violence against women if they see abuse happening, contemplation of gender norms, belief that men and women deserve gender equality, etc. The results are strong and consistent. And again, if you want to see those results more in depth, we have a paper under review, an academic paper under review that has all of the data. And if you want to see it in the meantime before it comes out, you can contact Claire or me, and we'd be happy to share a draft. Okay, next slide, please. So in conclusion, we have a couple of takeaways for you, which is that programming for social norms change at scale is possible, and that both broad and deep programming can be successful. So whether that is branded communications designed to reach a mass audience, or in-depth programming with target groups of youth, we see larger positive changes over time in a number of different behavior areas related to gender equality. We continue to want to unpack why we didn't see quite as large a change for our purple young people with regards to violence against women and girls. And I think this is something that's really important for us as a community to think about. What is the messaging that's right? Is the social norms approach the right approach when it comes to violence against women and girls, or are there other bottlenecks that need to be considered? It's really that combination of broad and deep programming that allows us to have the spread of positive attitude and behavior change through peer networks. Okay, so, oops, yeah, so that's what I have to share with you. And I think, Mark, I know that we're over time, but if you want to facilitate questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Well, we actually, we're not over time per se. We did say in the invitation that this would be an 1.5 hour long webinar, but I also know from experience that people just start to disappear at the hour mark, and we've already gone from 50 to 39 people. So we are over time in the sense that we're over people's attention spans, but the first should be, you should be starting to see a list of, a list of places where you can get more information about the webinar series that you're hearing about, all of the V4C documents. So here are the links, and we will put these in the chat box. Contact information, the website, and where you can sign up for the LINEA network and the listserv and contact people, the Twitter account and the YouTube channel, same for us. I will leave this up, but I do briefly want to go through the questions, which I have regrouped into new areas. So let me pause showing my screen while I go through this. So we had a number of questions about the program, and normally we have to really prompt people to share questions, but not this time. On the program, I'm going to bring 3 questions to Carolyn. Abir Abi Khalil asked, what was the level of government involvement? How much did it cost? I know you gave us a figure at the beginning, and who funded it. I know that it was Diffusion, but was there government contribution, especially given that it was a 5-year plan? Roberta Caccetti asked, did the age of girls versus women play any role in tackling social norms? Was there any difference in the analysis and in the approaches? And finally, Mary Dawson asked how information was shared in Nigeria with other groups working there, giving us some examples: the Peace and Security Network, which is based in Abuja, or the Women of Peace, or FOMWAN, the Fed or Muslim Women's Association in Nigeria. I'm guessing Fed means federal. Then we had a number of questions about the measurement. Mathilde Gunsberger asking about the lessons and the learning from images and other research that may or may not have been taken on board. Juliana Burungi wanted to know more about the in-between, and by in-between I think she means the ongoing monitoring tools. Given that before and after studies can be expensive, how were you tracking over time? We did have a recommendation to do a whole webinar on the methodology, which would be for the research and measurement nerds among you, I would say among us, but I'm not one of you. So that is a great idea that we take on board. And then 2 questions from Philly Desai about the measurement. What was the difference in change between the intensive purple people and the non-intensive purple people? And then secondly from Philly, what evidence did the APSN survey find about the relationship between perceptions of social norms and people's own attitudes and behavior? And I know that you have begun to address some of those, but if you wanted to go into a little bit more detail. 2 last questions, and then I'll bring it back to each of you for about 5 minutes each, and then we will wrap up. On sustainability, Roberta Caccetti asked again, were there any lessons learned about ensuring sustainability of results in young people? And then Philly asked to the whole audience if others had experience using social norms approaches to target violence against women and the effectiveness of that targeting. So there are the questions. I'm going to unpause, and so hopefully you're seeing the full screen there again, but I will bring it up. And so over to Carolyn and Elaine and Claire for some reactions to those. Feel free to chime in with more questions. I think this will take most of our time, but do feel free to chime
in. Okay, I will be quick. In level of government involvement, well, first of all, it was a £29 million programme funded by DFID or UK Aid. The government was involved to the extent that we informed and we shared at state level the program intention, and we got political buy-in. We also worked with the government. We worked with the government more on the legal frameworks elements. It was quite intentional not to work with the government through the branding and marketing, because we really looked at how change happens, and in terms of attitudinal and behaviour change in Nigeria, government isn't a strong driver. So we knew that it was young people, and it was sort of a popular movement was going to shift attitudes and behaviours more. So that was quite intentional, the way that we worked with government. In terms of the age of girls versus women, we had, maybe we didn't mention, we had a 16 to 25-year-old. So it really was sort of young women rather than sort of young girls versus older women. But maybe Elaine is our results guru and knows this stuff inside out. So I would defer to Elaine to see if there is any analysis of difference between 16 to, say, a 25-year-old. But I know even though those were our target population, we had followers who were 70 years old, who were self-proclaimed purple people. Information shared in Nigeria. So we did have national and state level sharing events. We worked with, actually I should mention that Palladium, Social Development Direct, Itad, and RAPA were all partners on the consortia of V4C. And RAPA is a lead women's rights program agency, so they were core to sharing in the learnings inside. So we had core learning events, but interestingly, the ones that you're mentioning here, this Peace and Security Network, I don't think they were on our radar. But just to say that, I mean, I am based in Nigeria, and if anybody would like to reach out and ask, I'm quite happy to go along to a network meeting and do a quick presentation if you feel that's useful. Maybe let me pass on for now onto the measurement questions. And then Claire, you or Elaine, if you want me to pick sustainability at the end, I can.
Sure. How about I'll pick up on your point on the age of girls and women, and then segue into some of the other evaluation questions, Caroline. So the attitudes practices and social norms survey that we ran was representative for young people ages 16 to 25, and we tracked them for 4 years. We haven't done much analysis within that target population. So this is a wonderful comment, and I think it'd be really interesting to look at how we have variation among that age group. I can say that in the limited analysis that I've done of people who would still be in secondary school or secondary school aged versus not, we do see certain differences in behavior, more in terms of just their reality being shaped more by family, kind of ties to family, or thinking about school and work and economic considerations more as an independent actor. But that's more preliminary, and we haven't done a lot of in-depth parsing of the data. What I do want to say is that this programming had a secondary target audience as well of young people up to the age of 35. And in some of our qualitative work, we brought in people into that older age group and in our communication survey as well. And we saw quite similar changes in that slightly older demographic as well. So the results that we presented, I think, probably underestimate the number of people reached and the amount of change that happened, because our survey is only representative and only allows us to extrapolate out to populations within that young adult or young people 16 to 25 demographic. And so we don't actually know how many other people had their attitudes and behavior change. And you know, we would have loved to have done a survey that allowed us to say more about people outside that target age group, but the survey was already quite expansive and fairly expensive, and so we, in order to have enough people in the survey to say something meaningful about this target group, we had to focus there rather than bringing in a larger demographic. The other thing I just want to highlight, because I think it's really important, is that we did focus groups among adult men and women as well, but we don't have a lot of quantitative data on how older adults were changing their attitudes and behaviors in response to our programming. And one thing that we've thought about more over time is that it is about the ways in which older adults may continue to be, in some ways, the gatekeepers of gender norms. So is it enough to change the attitudes and perceptions of young people when their reference group is still older adults? And we saw in our survey, we asked questions about who young people looked to for approval or for guidance on specific gender issues. And we continued to see parents, partners, religious and traditional leaders as being these key gatekeepers, key influencers, key reference group. So if parents are still a reference group that affects how people behave, in the future, I think future norms programming might want to think about how to gather data on the attitudes and behaviors of that reference group in addition to the target population, and to just be aware when those two may not be the same, because you may want to be targeting young people but needing to shift a different demographic as well in order to open those gates and allow change to happen faster. Speaking to the question about images, I mean, Caroline, you might actually be in a better place to talk about the images survey. Images was a one-time survey done in collaboration with Promundo. It's fantastic resource, and the results from that survey were really instrumental in shaping how we thought about the Purple brand and about marketing. And I think going forward, it would be really beneficial to think about how the questions on the Promundo images survey could be adapted to a social norms framework so that one could measure changes in norms directly related to positive masculinity. And so images was run in slightly different states that overlapped with the 4 target states in our APSN programming. But there was overlap, but not complete overlap, which made it a little bit more difficult to directly compare or apply the images lessons in an evaluation context. We used it more to inform programming rather than to show that the programming was working, since it was a one-off endeavor. In terms of ongoing monitoring and tracking over time, I would say that a number of our programs collected information and feedback from participants in real time, and we had different team members who were looking at that, whether that's on social media, whether it was in the discussion forums on the radio, whether it was feedback from our online Purple Academy participants. And that input was also useful in helping us know whether we were having the right message or not. The other thing to emphasize is that the results that we presented were baseline and endline, but we also ran 2 additional waves of the survey in each of the middle years of the program. So that allowed us to see what was changing or not and adapt in real time. And so, Caroline had talked before about the emergence of the 50-50 campaign after a year of programming. And that also was reflected in the second wave of our survey when it appeared that brand recognition wasn't as widespread as we would have expected, and it caused us to go back to the drawing board and think about strategies for more effectively reaching a broader population. So that those midline surveys were really helpful in helping us tweak our strategy and understand what could be working better and why. And then we were also doing core values research, qualitative work, focus groups throughout in order to understand how to best pitch the messaging and how people were thinking about gender equality and whether our messages were resonating. So I'll leave it there, and Caroline, if you want to answer any questions about sustainability, I'll let you do that. Well, actually, before you do that, I realized that I didn't speak to Philly's question about the difference in change for intensive versus non-intensive programming. So we see large self-reported positive change for people who had more in-depth exposure. And I talked about this thinking about diffusion a bit as well. In our survey, you'll see, in our report, you'll see that in the APSN survey, about 1% of young people in Nigeria had the in-depth in-school or after-school programming, which is these 10-week workshops where they really deeply engage in gender norms. And it's really exciting that our random sample of Nigerian youth picked up the prevalence of safe spaces participants. But in this random selection of Nigerian youth, that slice wasn't large enough to show positive, significant change within our APSN study specifically, just because when you take 1% of Nigerian young people and distill it down to a survey population, that's only about 40 respondents, which is still really impressive that we picked it up. But from a statistical point of view, it makes it a little bit harder. So what we did is that we actually ran a supplemental survey where we asked the same questions to people who had participated in our online academy and in our in-school, after-school programming. And we compared changes over time for that group of people compared to our general population. And the changes are much larger and much stronger for the people who had intensive programming. So I think what this means is that practitioners who are faced with budget constraints really have this trade-off to think about. Do we go for breadth or do you go for depth? And the nice thing about Voices for Change is that it was able to do a little bit of both. That we could reach a mass audience and work for widespread behavior and attitude change with the recognition that deeper programming leads to faster and deeper change. And even if it doesn't reach as many people. Although there is the opportunity for diffusion through friend networks. So
thank you so much.
That's the respect.
And Claire, you just sent a little note. We have 4 or 5 minutes left, and you just mentioned that you wanted to come in on the measurement framework and sustainability. So you get the last word, and then we will wrap it up and let people enjoy the rest of their days or evenings.
Sure, yeah, I'll speak to the measurement framework. I think Caroline's probably best placed to respond on the sustainability issue. I think on the measurement framework, we had a results framework which drew upon the APSN and a number of the other tools that I flagged, but obviously had other measurement tools much more lower down the results chain. So that log frame is what DFID used to hold us to account. It's what we use to hold ourselves account and ask ourselves, are we achieving what we set out to do? And if not, why not? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that measurement framework. And I think, this question of most useful indicators, that's a hard one to answer, but I can give you some insights into what I think is important in that measurement framework. So first and foremost, it's identifying indicators across the results chain. So understanding what you think your results chain is and identifying critical measures at each stage of that results chain to track on a regular basis. And for V4C, I would say that the key things we were tracking was, first of all, reach. Were we getting that breadth of reach that we were expected to create population-wide change? We were measuring change in knowledge. So were our interventions delivering a shift in people's understanding of gender equality? Were our interventions leading to other people taking action, because it was supposed to catalyze other people into action and create that ripple effect? And then only then did we get onto our attitudes changing and our practices changing of both the young people themselves and their reference groups, their peers. So those, I think, are the five sort of variables that infuse our results framework that we were regularly tracking. We took quite a quantitative approach in our measurement, and that was a tactical decision because we felt that the donor would ask questions. If we adopted a very qualitative approach, then we would face challenges around the level of change, the scale of change, and obviously the scale we were operating at. You had to go down a quantitative route. I think possibly we went too far down the quantitative route, and in later stages of the program suffered because we didn't have enough qualitative data to really create the story of change that was happening, and so getting a better balance between quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators, I think, is a takeaway for me. I think the combination, thinking about the outcome level, measuring that outcome level change. So we, as Elaine mentioned, we were measuring attitudes, practices of individuals, but obviously but also their perceptions of what others were doing. So that social norms dimension. So that's an important thing to build in if you're taking a social norms approach. That combination of the APSN with the how change happens was a really powerful combination, and I think really now helps us tell our story. So having really, really robust quantitative data through the APSN, but with some really interesting qualitative contextual data that unpacks how change has happened from the people who've been involved in purple. That's a very powerful combination. So I'd really recommend that approach. And the other thing I think I would say is sort of midway into the program, when we were achieving scale but not yet seeing significant change at scale, we realized we needed a bit of a safety net. So our qualitative data, our sort of our output level data was telling us we're on the right track, but we weren't seeing that at the outcome level. So we needed a safety net to help us explain that if we didn't manage to achieve our outcome level targets, that it didn't mean that the approach was invalid. And so we then built in a supplemental sample to the APSN survey, which looked at the direct beneficiaries of V4C and looked at the change happening there. So that allowed us to say, even if we didn't manage to achieve that population-wide change, then we could rely on the changes within the direct beneficiaries and still have something valid and show some validity to the approach. Thankfully, we haven't needed to rely on the latter. It's added another lens and has allowed a deeper understanding of the difference between those who've been involved in intensive programming and those who haven't been involved in intensive programming. But that is a safety net that I'm really glad that we did. So those are my few insights on the measurement framework, and I'll hand over to Caroline to close on sustainability.
And Carolyn, you get exactly 30 seconds because we are now at 1 hour and 31 minutes and our participants are dropping like flies.
Quickly, there were elements that were sustainable, working with religious traditional leaders, work with media and existing men's groups. What I would do differently to increase sense of possibility of sustainability was build in private sector involvement from the start. By the end of the program, we had banks, we had mobile companies approaching us to look at branding and supporting us because they realized we had a base, a youth base that they wanted to market to. But that was not possible at the onset because we needed to build the brand first. So building in that private sector engagement from onset, I think would have helped. I wouldn't not do the brand in future.
I mean, absolutely, truly fascinating. A new way for international development workers to approach it, to measure it, to think about what we're working towards, and to do this in partnership with amazing local marketing agencies. Thank you to Carolyn, Claire, Elaine, Marie-Céline. I think this has been a great webinar to kick us off. One thing I keep thinking of as I hear us talking about purple, purple, purple is many languages in West Africa don't even have a word for purple. And so this is kind of the new frontier that we're moving into. In Niger, there's a filmmaker who made a movie. He remade Purple Rain, the Prince movie, and in the language that the movie was made in, it was red with a little bit of blue. So that's the area we're in here, is purple or red with a little bit of blue. And I thank you all. With your permission, Carolyn, Claire, and Elaine, we will send your contact information with all of the other contact information that's up here to the people who participated today, with the recording and with the presentations. And we did have one question that came in at the end that we didn't get to, that I will follow up with all of you individually. But otherwise, thanks to all of you so much. You're leading us into a new frontier of how we figure out how to make the world a more equitable place and to transform social and gender norms in a way that helps all of us. So thanks to all. And have a great rest of the day, everyone.